Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is Episode 13, Isaac Asimov Part 2, Robots. Or rather, I want to talk about robots in general in this episode, not just Asimov's take on them. The focus is definitely still on Asimov, because he was so important to the concept, but it's a topic that we haven't looked at before in this series, and there's quite a lot of background to it. In fact, robot-like machines are well attested in proto-sci-fi and pre-sci-fi literature, in contrast to many other sci-fi tropes, so we should really back up and take a closer look. Long before robots as we know them were conceived of in fact or fiction, their precursor was the automaton. An automaton is an automatic, usually clockwork machine that runs on its own. The term often implies a machine that imitates a person or animal in some way, but any self-operating machine will do. And automata were no mere stories. People built them all the way back in ancient times. In the historical record, automata date back at least to the 3rd century BC, with Ctesibios, the first librarian of Alexandria, and the inventor of the cuckoo clock. However, mythical or semi-mythical accounts of them are much older, suggesting that people could at least imagine the idea as far back as the Bronze Age. These accounts include the Greek myth of Talos, and much later, the Jewish legend of the Golem of Prague. Both of these were automata that looked and acted human instead of mere mechanical creations, which of course wouldn't have been literally possible. But we have hard evidence that at least some of the feats attributed to ancient automata were possible in the form of the Antikythera Mechanism, a complex astronomical computer dating to the 2nd century BC. What's more, even ancient automata were sometimes described as programmable in some way, like modern computers, and they could exhibit complex behaviors. Many automata described from the Middle Ages onwards could sing and dance or play musical instruments as a form of elaborate music box. As technology continued to progress, automata experienced a golden age in the 19th century, especially in Paris, where many makers of them lived, including one Georges Méliès, the father of cinema, whom we met in Episode 8. So the idea of self-operating machines, even intelligent ones, was a very old one, and was in fact one with more of a historical tradition than other sci-fi tropes, like space aliens or time travel. Like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which itself shares many similarities with robot fiction, the authors who first wrote about them were simply applying modern science to an old story. The early versions of automata in fiction were of course biological, clockwork, or steam-powered. However, an electrically powered automaton first appeared in the 1885 novel Frank Reed and His Electric Man by Louis Senarens. Today, the word automaton is used more for what we might call dumb machines, that only follow simple programs and can't think for themselves. Perhaps because they were a real invention, they needed to be differentiated from the fantastical creations of fiction as technology advanced. However, the opposite happened with the word android, which was also used for automata as early as 1728. Android literally means man-like, and it was used specifically for automata that resembled humans. Today, it retains pretty much the same meaning, a robot that looks like a human, albeit to varying degrees. It can mean a robot that can completely pass for a human, or it can mean one that is merely human-shaped, like Honda's Asimo, which was, of course, named for Isaac Asimov. Android also appears in fiction at least as early as the 1886 novel The Future Eve, by Auguste Villiers de l'Isle-Adam. The word robot, however, didn't exist yet. The robot was introduced by the Czech playwright Karel Čapek in his 1920 play RUR, short for Rossum's Universal Robots. According to Čapek, his brother Joseph was the one who coined the word, from the Czech word robota, meaning forced labor. Karel's original idea was derived from Latin, labori. Robot definitely sounds better. RUR is not a work you hear about much today, but it was very popular in the 1920s. It arrived on stage in New York in 1922 and was published in English the following year, and the word robot quickly replaced automaton and android as the standard name for a self-operating machine. Ironically, the robots in RUR are still biological organisms, even though the costumes in the original performance look an awful lot like metal armor. The robots are made in a factory from a form of artificial protoplasm. They're physically stronger than humans and are seemingly without emotions, at least at first, but they're still creatures of flesh and blood, which is the one thing robots are usually not allowed to be made from. In fact, Arthur C. Clarke coined the portmanteau biot for biological robot in Rendezvous with Rama to distinguish them. But in the early 20th century, the distinction was not so clear. RUR tells of a world where the inventor Rossum's robots have become widespread, taking the place of human labor all over the world. But as you might expect, the combination of making the world's economy ever more dependent on robots and striving to create ever more sophisticated and intelligent robots spells disaster. The robots, not quite as unfeeling as they seem, rebel against their creators, and humanity is doomed. Yes, this play really was written 100 years ago this year. It sounds like it could have been written in 2020 as easily as 1920, perhaps as an episode of Black Mirror. You notice even more similarities if you read the whole thing. Čapek seems to have been truly ahead of his time, or perhaps, given the similarities with Frankenstein, these questions are older than we think. After all, the Frankenstein plot was quite common in the early days of the genre, something Isaac Asimov didn't care for. RUR was popular enough that the word robot became widely used, certainly enough for Isaac Asimov to use it when he wrote his first robot story in 1939, though not universal. Plenty of other names have been used over the years. In Fritz Lang's Metropolis in 1927, for example, Maria's doppelganger is described as a Maschinenmensch, machine human. The word drone for an unmanned aerial vehicle came from the Royal Air Force's remote-controlled Queen Bee airplane in 1935, which was used as target practice for battleships. A drone seemed like a more appropriate insect-themed nickname for a plane that would make one flight and immediately get shot down. Today, of course, drones are also considered a type of robot. Modern sci-fi has even more. George Lucas shortened android to droid in Star Wars, referring to any robot, probably because he wanted a word more alien and exotic than robot. Similarly, Ridley Scott replaced Philip K. Dick's use of android with replicant in Blade Runner. Various properties have used synth and many other names. It seems similar to the trend of movies and TV shows that want to differentiate themselves using a different word for zombies or superheroes or any other kind of sci-fi stock character. One other word that you hear mostly in science fiction is cyborg, usually meaning a character who is half human and half machine. But that one actually comes from science fact. Cyborg is short for cybernetic organism, and the term was coined by engineer Manfred Clynes and psychologist Nathan Kline in 1960 to refer to a human being enhanced by technology to be able to survive in space. The root word cybernetics was coined by Norman Weiner in 1948, and actually refers to a broader science of control and communication in both animals and machines. The word comes from the Greek kybernetes, meaning steersman or pilot. In the context of robotics, cybernetics would be more about how a robot's brain can control its body and communicate with its surroundings. But this episode is mainly about Isaac Asimov and how he shaped the genre. As I said, in the 1920s and 30s, most robots in fiction took the road of Frankenstein's monster and turned against their creators. The Maschinenmensch in Metropolis is an exception. She caused violence and mayhem on the orders of her creator instead of turning on him. But Asimov saw this idea, implicitly both of these ideas, as technophobic and sought to turn it around, creating a robot character who was loyal and helpful and could even be trusted with children. This was Robbie, the title character of Asimov's first robot story, not to be confused with Robbie the robot from the movie Forbidden Planet. Robbie is a robotic nanny for a young girl named Gloria. He's a primitive robot by Asimov standards, wildly different from the next couple stories he wrote, Reason and Liar. Robbie is mute, not very intelligent, and in the eyes of Gloria's parents, interchangeable with a dog. Indeed, even the experimental talking robot that appears briefly in the story is less intelligent than Siri or Alexa and completely crashes when asked a question that can't parse. But Gloria loves Robbie like a human, and Robbie's dedication to Gloria's well-being is unmistakable because he's specifically built for the purpose. In the original, that is. Asimov didn't articulate the 3 laws of robotics until Runaround in 1942. In 1950, Asimov collected 8 of his previously published robot stories and 1 new one into perhaps his most famous novel, I, Robot, a title he borrowed from a short story by Earl and Otto Binder from 1939. This fix-up novel shows robots developing from mute near automatons like Robbie up to Stephen Byerly, who passes for human so well, even with having to obey the 3 laws, that he gets himself elected president. Or rather, world coordinator. Sci-fi jargon again. The story is framed as an interview with the famous robo-psychologist Susan Calvin, who was involved in many of the incidents described therein. As an aside, the 2004 movie starring Will Smith, while pretty good, had almost nothing to do with the book. The studio bought an original screenplay by Jeff Vintar of Final Fantasy The Spirits Within fame. They slapped Asimov's 3 laws on it, tossed in bits of Little Lost Robot and The Evitable Conflict, and ultimately wound up with something that was more similar to The Caves of Steel by sheer coincidence. The Caves of Steel, from 1954, was Asimov's first real robot novel rather than a fix-up. It describes a future Earth that is overpopulated with 8 billion people. Times have changed, haven't they? The Earth's population is crowded into domed cities, too agoraphobic to even want to leave, and where robots are strictly regulated to keep them from taking over the labor market. The Earthlings are kept segregated from the Spacers, who colonize other planets, but live in a sterile environment and cannot tolerate contamination from Earth. In this tense environment, the robot skeptical detective Elijah Bailey and the humanoid spacer robot R. Daniel Olivaw are tasked with solving the mysterious murder of a spacer. It's a good mystery story, and the first of several about Bailey and especially Olivaw, who appears repeatedly in Asimov's works, even into the Foundation series. But Asimov's impact on robot fiction was more about his ideas than his specific writings, most notably his 3 laws of robotics. As they appear on the first page of I, Robot, the first law: a robot may not injure a human being, or, through an action, allow a human being to come to harm. The second law: a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And the third law: a robot must protect its own existence, as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. They sound simple, foolproof. The 2004 film described them with the in-story slogan, quote, "the perfect circle of protection," unquote. But the conceit of the book I, Robot is that Asimov tells you the 3 laws on the first page, and then uses the rest of the book to show all the ways they can go wrong. Even the trope of the Zeroth Law Rebellion, where robots take over the world, quote-unquote, for our own good, was perhaps popularized by the movie in modern times, but it comes straight from Asimov's story, The Evitable Conflict. Also, since it kept bugging me, I checked, and yes, evitable really is a word. It means avoidable. It's just that we only ever hear it as inevitable, so it's harder to parse on its own. Regardless, Asimov's 3 laws of robotics are still referenced in science fiction and real-life research today, not as a serious proposal. Our discussions of robot ethics with things like self-driving cars are far more advanced today, but as a useful reference point, something that helps us understand the problem. In fact, more than the 3 laws, Asimov coined the word robotics itself, although he believed at the time that it was already in use. And robotics is now a real discipline much more than psychohistory is. Culturally, at least, you could possibly count him as influential to the field as Turing and von Neumann. Asimov also coined the phrase positronic brain. This was simple technobabble. A positron is an antimatter electron, so positronic was just a way to talk about something that should be electronic, but would sound more sci-fi. Nonetheless, the positronic brain has been used multiple times since, most notably for Data in Star Trek: The Next Generation. The idea of defeating a robot with a logical paradox, later popularized to some extent by 2001: A Space Odyssey and especially by Star Trek, may have first appeared, it's certainly the earliest version I've seen, in Asimov's Liar in 1941. The trope of the robot that strives to become human, which, while it goes back to RUR or even to Frankenstein, famously appears in Asimov's 1976 novella, The Bicentennial Man, which was later expanded into a full-length novel, The Positronic Man, in 1992, and a 1999 film starring Robin Williams. And as for science fiction in general, well, what can I say except that Asimov opened the floodgates. Ray Bradbury's Mechanical Hound in Fahrenheit 451, Gort from The Day the Earth Stood Still, Forbidden Planet's Robbie the Robot, Astro Boy, and more, and that's just from the 1950s. After Asimov, robots were all the rage, with far more possibilities than the Frankenstein plot. And yet, Asimov certainly isn't the whole story. By 1980, there was another source of inspiration for robot fiction that was even more powerful: real life. Just as automata were real inventions and not just fairy tales centuries before what we would call robots today existed, so too has the technology of robots advanced at the same breakneck pace as computers, to the point where they are able to emulate and even surpass some of Asimov's imaginings. Robots as creations of human scientists in the present day started to crop up in the 70s. Mechagodzilla and the Stepford Wives, for example. By the 80s, they were all over the place. Tron might be the first big one of that genre, but the first of many. We'll come back to notable robots along the way as we continue with this series, and especially when we get to cyberpunk. For now, keep in mind that in the Golden Age, and probably up through the 70s, a lot of the concepts of robotics in sci-fi owed their existence to Isaac Asimov. For all his wide-ranging literary work, his influence was probably deepest in this subgenre, with a legacy extending far beyond his own writings. This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is available at whatever website you're on right now, and a bunch of others, including my personal website, sciencemeetsfiction.com. Check it out if you want to see reviews of the new Cosmos series with Neil deGrasse Tyson, Possible Worlds. My book recommendation for this episode is I, Robot. I did enjoy The Caves of Steel, and I normally go with full-length novels over anthologies, but I think I, Robot better captures Asimov's dynamic range when it comes to robots. And after all, he is best known for his short stories. It's a good read that really gets you thinking about how the three laws work in a way you don't always get elsewhere. Next episode, it's on to the next big-name author of the Golden Age, Robert Heinlein, and how he was instrumental to the idea of children's science fiction. Thanks for listening.